Welcome to this studio for this inaugural interview for the 5 years anniversary of the Political Daily. I'm very glad and I'm honored to have this discussion with you.
It's a really great pleasure and honor being here today. Congratulations for 5 years of exceptional news and information analysis.
So I would like to dive into immediately into Greek economy. The government is talking about the success story. We are a few years after a huge crisis, and right now we are having a GDP growing more than twice from the European Union. For how long do you think we can sustain something like that in Greece?
Yes, the comeback of the Greek economy from the crisis that occurred around 2010 has been remarkable. And at that time, public debt crisis, financial crisis, banks going bankrupt, massive rates of unemployment, economic collapse. People were even talking about leaving the Eurozone and defaulting on the debt. I think you have to give credit to the governments of Greece over time, including especially the last one, for having done fiscal reform, having stabilized the fiscal balances, have done stabilization of the financial system, cleaning up non-performing loans at the banks, reprivatizing them, and starting to do a variety of structural reform to increase potential growth. And that's why Greece right now is growing faster than the rest of the Eurozone. Some of that stuff is due to the policies, but you cannot be complacent. Greece, like the rest of the Eurozone, needs structural reforms to increase potential growth. If those structural reforms occur, whether it's judicial, reducing red tape, bureaucracy, greater labor force participation, especially of women, investing in technology, innovation, knowledge, educating your own people for the skills of the future, wide range of things. If things are done, potential growth is going to increase even further. And I'm confident these things are going to be happening over time. But some of the recent recovery is driven by the good reforms. Some of it is that there are these next EU generation funds coming from the EU that have boosted investment, green transition, digital, and so on. Once those funds are going to be phased out in the next couple of years, you need to have private investment rather than just public investment driving this kind of growth. And you have to make sure that while you're sustaining also consumption growth, there's also investment. Because investment, especially in the technology of the future, is a driver of that type of growth. So things are going well, but that doesn't imply that you need to be complacent. The reforms have to continue and to accelerate. If that's the case, then Greece is going to continue to do very well.
Is there, however, a problem since Greece is in Europe, and in Europe right now there is a crisis, let's say. France is under political crisis, Germany is facing an economic crisis after losing the cheap energy from Russia, Italy is in a debt crisis. These are the biggest economies of the European Union, and most of the time these are the tourists from these countries. Most of the tourists are coming in Greece. So is there a problem in the future that we end up having less to send to Europe, less commodities to sell to Europe, to export, and less tourists to come into Greece?
You make a very valid argument, since Greece is part of the European economy. If the European economy doesn't grow very fast, then of course that has implications for Greek economic growth, even if you're doing the right policy. 15 years ago during the crisis, the countries were in trouble with Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. The strong one were France and Germany. Today is the opposite. Greece, Spain, Portugal, even Italy are doing reasonably well, while the core of Europe, France and Germany, but also Netherlands and others, are having a weak economic growth. that weaken economic growth in the center of Europe, of course, through trade channels, through tourism, can have spillovers for Greece as well. But I would say, if countries do the right thing on their own, they can grow at a reasonable rate, even if the rest of Europe is weaker. Two, there are opportunities for having to do business and diversify away yourself, not just from Europe, but also to other parts of the world. Tourists are coming now to Greece, even in large amounts, say, from Israel, because Turkey is seen as being more risky. Mm-hmm. They can come from Middle East, they can come from Asia, and so on. So while you are, of course, trade and financially more connected with Europe, you should think of yourselves, also given your important location, as being a liaison between East and West, between North and South. So the markets are global. Of course, Europe has to do more, but I'm confident that the Europeans, whenever there is pressure, sometimes there is a crisis or external pressure, either the global financial crisis or the crisis that we had around 2010 in Greece and some of the southern parts of Europe, even after COVID, then Europe integrates more. And as long as Europe over time is going to integrate more, then you have more potential growth, more competitiveness, more competition, more productivity, more of an economic union, and that can benefit Europe. After all, these technologies of the future related to artificial intelligence and others, you can innovate, and there is talent in Europe. And even if you don't innovate as much, if you adopt this technology, you can have increases in productivity and potential growth. So countries, can do a lot on their own, but of course they're part of Europe. And Europe has to become a single market, has to become more competitive so that all the boats are lifted together.
I think I'll come back to artificial technology later on. However, right now Europe seems to be facing something like a Trump crisis with all this shock that there is at the markets. How do you think this will Europe will manage to face this new situation from the tariffs?
Well, I do believe that paradoxically, the Trump shock is a good shock for Europe because, as I pointed out in the past, Europeans usually try to manage the ordinary. And in this changed world, you cannot just manage the ordinary. You have to do reforms, you have to accelerate innovation. And whenever there is a shock, as I said, the GFC, COVID, the Greek crisis, then there is more integration, more attempt to do the right thing. So maybe Europe needed the Trump shock, is a shock on trade, also the shock on the need to invest into your own security, into do faster green transition, to become less dependent on the United States. So maybe this Trump shock, even the Putin shock, is going to shock Europe to decide to defend itself more on its own and spend more on defense. So the tariff coming from the US are large. They've gone from an average of 3% to 15%, but 15% is something that Europe can live with. Of course, they're not as positive. I mean, you have low tariffs, but they're not going to destroy Europe, those tariffs. There'll be a slowdown of growth this year, but then a recovery into next year. The reports by Letta and Draghi suggested that intra-European restrictions to trade are much larger, 2x for goods, up to 4x for services, than what Trump has imposed. In the US, when you have a new product or service or an app, you have a market of 330 million people. In Europe, that is a market of 400 million people. There are 28 different national regulations. And as Letta said, we don't have yet a full single market. So you need to complete that single market so that you have a true market of 400 million people. So in some sense, I believe these shocks are going to force the Europeans to get their act together and do the right thing. Because if there is not pressure, a shock, or a crisis, Europeans tend to drift sideways as opposed to accelerating the necessary changes.
Some are afraid, though, that the political people of Europe are not, let's say, so competent as the old ones? Do you agree with something like that?
We have problems at the political level. In most countries, you have divisions, polarization, fragmented coalition governments. Some of them, like in France right now, effectively Macron is a lame duck. But eventually, hopefully sooner or later, there will be a new president, a new government. We'll have to take action. In Germany, Merz is still finding his own way in its footing, but Germany knows where to spend more on defense, on infrastructure, on digitalization, on opening up to have the challenges. And Germany has always had a great base of knowledge, scientists, engineers. So they used to be the sick man of Europe, then they did reform, then they didn't do much. Now they're forced to do more reforms. So they're going to find their way, and they're going to drive then over time growth. And, in Greece, you have very strong leadership. Even in Italy, Meloni turned out to be a moderate force and so on. So, yeah, you might not have the great post-World War II titans of politics that were generated by World War II, but there are forces within countries and even at the European level that are going to push for reform and for integration because there is no alternative. You need a full single market, you need competitiveness, you need investment, you need a capital markets union, you need a full banking union, you need a savings and investment union, you need a fiscal union, foreign policy, migration, defense, and so on. These things are happening. They're not happening as fast as they could or should, but I think that all of them are going in the right direction, nudged by external pressures.
Coming back to Greece, we seem to have, for years now, a demographic problem. However, this government right now decided to, from the Thessaloniki expedition, to announce new reforms, tax reductions for families with loads of kids, with 4 or 5 kids, and give good reduction. Do you think that the demographic is a really big problem that we will see very soon becoming, let's say, bursting out in Greece?
My answer will be yes and no. First of all, in Greece, labor force participation rate are still low, especially for women. And if you can raise the labor force participation rate for women in a society that increases labor supply and therefore potential growth, and therefore even your policy towards family have to be nuanced. In some parts of Europe, like Italy, if you're a mother, you can give up to work for many months, if not years, and you get a lot of support. But the longer you stay out of the labor force, the less likely you're going to come back. As opposed to some Nordic country would say, we don't give you benefits for long, but you'll have very cheap childcare. So if you go back to work, then you can make sure your children have childcare. So those kind of the design of labor force participation and fertility and so on matter, and doing it in a right way and increasing the supply of labor, especially for those who are not participating, is important. That can by itself, regardless of migration or fertility rates, improve the economic growth outlook. The second point I'll make is that historically, countries that have high population growth tend to grow faster. Those that have decline, they tend to grow slower. But that was in a world before artificial intelligence. Whether you like it or not, artificial intelligence in the long term, it's going to take decades, not overnight, is going to destroy more jobs than it creates. And therefore, there is a risk of permanent technological unemployment. Now, if that's true, countries that have declined in their population can manage that technological employment better than countries like Sub-Saharan Africa or India or others in Asia that have massive population growth. So if you have massive population growth, eventually robots and machines are going to do more of the blue-collar and white-collar jobs, the manual work, the cognitive work as well. So if your population is declining, you can manage the transition better. So I know that people are worried about fertility rates, but actually Europe, we have high stocks of capital physical capital, social capital, human capital, having lower population and having good institution and being able to innovate, adopt technology, can manage these AI onslaught of jobs better than countries that have a bursting of population. So for me, declining population is not a problem. You can increase the labor force participation of groups like women. You can rely in the short term for migration. If you don't want migration, machines are going to do a lot of the jobs, like in Japan. And the most important thing is to make sure that the people exist, young, middle, old, are retrained for the technologies and the jobs of the future. And that's where most of the investment will occur. So eventually machines are going to do more of the work. So having less people is not going to be a problem. Actually, it's going to be an advantage, I would say, over time if you manage it right.
However, another form of this demographic problem, at least in Greece, but I think in most countries, is the urbanization thing. I mean, people are coming into Athens or Thessaloniki or Patra every day to live. And as a result, there are more people coming to urban areas, and they are looking for houses, which means that we end up having higher rents some years now, higher house prices going up. And so this, apart from the demographic problem, could it be a bubble of the housing again?
Certainly what they describe, the urbanization and limited supply of housing is leading to a rise in home prices that is becoming hurtful, or for those who don't buy and rent also. It is an issue. And in case of Greece, compared to other parts of Europe, in Italy or in Germany, you might have a dozen cities that are center of economic activity. In Greece, as you point out, you have three, maybe a fourth one if you include Crete. So there's too much concentration of economic activity. Now, technology, by the way, allows you to, reduce the concentration of economic activity. You can work from home, you can work remotely. So over time, actually, when people are going to find it's too expensive to live in Athens, but you could work from an island or whatever and work remotely, maybe some of this pressure are going to change. After COVID, many people in the US work from home, work from the homes in the suburbs. They don't need to be in Manhattan. But if you want to address this housing pressure, I would say that you have to work as much on the supply side. You cannot just work on the demand. If you give tax incentive for people to be able to buy homes, or if you do other things to reduce the mortgage cost, demand will go higher because people can afford it. But if supply is the same, the price will become higher, and therefore all those tax incentives are not going to do much.
So we'll backfire or something like that.
Eventually. Yes. So what you need to do is that you have to increase the supply of housing and real estate. And of course, Athens has limited land and is surrounded by mountains, but there are ways you can change zoning rules for building more vertically. If you don't want to do it in the center of Athens because you cover the Acropolis, you can do it in the periphery. But any policy regarding real estate and housing has to emphasize the supply side. If you do only the demand side, it's going to self-defeat.
That's true. Another thing that we have in Greece is, and I'm sure in other places too, we have a problem with prices. And this seems to coming again and again as having a source of the problem at energy. We still have problems with Russia and the energy that it was giving, the cheap energy that it was giving to Greece. Europe is supposed to buy energy already, have made agreements with the US in order to buy liquid gas. For how long maybe we will have this energy problem, which ends up making higher prices?
It'll take a while, but I think that Greece and Europe is committed to a green transition. You need, of course, more wind and solar and green tech. There are new technologies of carbon capture, sequestration, clean and green hydrogen, even smaller modular nuclear fission. Over time, next few years, fusion is going to come out, so there'll be a variety. And in the transition, we still need fossil fuels, and then of course you can rely more on natural gas and less on coal and oil that are more polluting. By the way, given the discoveries of natural gas basins throughout the Mediterranean, there are ways, and I know there are political and geopolitical challenges for Greece, Turkey, Israel, Cyprus to jointly develop some of these energy sources. For Israel, that has become a major source of reducing energy prices. Actually, the excess production is exported to Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, like Jordan. So I think there are new, reserves of natural gas that can be exploited and that should be co-developed by all the relevant countries in the region. And that may also, over time, be a source of investment. And natural gas is still a fossil fuel, but in the transition to truly green, we're going to need still plenty of natural gas as well. You need to have those energy policy, you need to have an energy policy for all of Europe as well.
And this discussion about the energy will be, however, at the center, at the core of the discussion about war. We're having many wars. I mean, we're still having the problem in Ukraine, of course, in Israel. We have, is there a possibility of a spillover through China, let's say, something like that? How do you think of those?
Well, unfortunately, Europe will have to spend more on its defense. One, because there are new and bigger threats coming from Russia becoming aggressive. Two, because whether you like it or not, US under Trump wants more burden sharing. The good news is that the Europeans have agreed at the NATO summit to spend more, up to 3.5% rather than 2% on defense over time, and another 1.5% in critical infrastructures. So that's positive. Now, some of the debate within Europe is say, okay, we need to spend more on defense, but we cannot eat guns and weapons. If we have more guns, we have less butter and bread. But I think it's the wrong trade-off. It's the wrong trade-off because one of the reasons why Europe is technologically behind the US, but also behind China, or behind nations that have invested a lot in technology, like now Ukraine or Israel, is that when you invest into weapons, you're investing into the technologies of the future, because most weapon systems have a dual use. And paradoxically, by investing more into guns, you're going to have more productivity, spillovers, startups, startup nations, and then you have benefits of higher productivity growth, higher wages, and higher bread and butter as well. So it's not one or the other. I think that actually has been a bit of a curse for Europe for the last 8 years to rely on defense from the US, because the US, through defense, has created the internet that was a military project, created the jumbo jet that used to be a military cargo project, and unfortunately before we had nuclear power, we had nuclear weapons. So a lot of innovation occurred through military spending and technology of the future, whether in the US, in China, in Israel, in Ukraine, and other countries spend more on defense. So for me, it's more guns to get more butter and bread rather than one or the other. And that's going to be positive. But of course, Europeans spending more on defense cannot spend on the same weapon system of the past. They cannot duplicate for 28 different militaries the same kind of things. There has to be integration, better procurement, but you have to invest into defense tech. So even the German, when they announced 200 billion euro more defense spending, they said we cannot keep on buying Leopard tanks that cost 50 million euros that can be destroyed by 10,000 euro drone. So the whole nature of defense is going to change. It's change of nature warfare is changing as an opportunity for Europe to invest into defense tech, in dual use, in commercial application, and become literally more productive.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I think we covered many topics, both Greek topics and international topics. Thank you very much for being here at this inaugural interview for the Political Daily. It was very nice having you here.
It's really a great pleasure great political news operation that shows how you can do it in new and creative ways, and hopeful for yourselves and for the future of Greece.
Thank you.